the Ukrainians have been very, very effective at building their own long-range drones, which might not go that fast, but they go a long way, and they are having a massive effect on the battlefield. I think particularly what I've been very impressed by, and I think will have profound implications for our own defence review, is just the rate at which these can be innovated.
Have we seen further innovation still over the course of the last 12 months?
Yeah, absolutely, James. I mean, it has been phenomenal, and I think it's also changed what our view is what drones are. I think many of us would have thought of drones as these little handheld devices that go buzzing around, take a few pictures, that you get as Christmas presents. And of course, what's happened is that there's a whole range now, not only those small ones that are very, very good at not being seen, provide eyes and ears over the battlefield, but also we've seen the long range drones, particularly. I think there's been a lot of talk by the end of the year about long range missiles. We'll get onto that, I'm sure. But the Ukrainians have been very, very effective at building their own long range drones, which might not go that fast, but they go a long way, and they are having a massive effect on the battlefield. I think particularly what I've been very impressed by, and I think will have profound implications for our own defence review, is just the rate at which these can be innovated. In the military, when I was part of the military machine, you devise a requirement, but it would often be 10 years before you saw that capability actually in service. And of course, a lot of the times, therefore, technology had far outpaced your ability to stay on top of it. What we're seeing this year is just a whole range of new drones coming in because you invent one drone that goes across, drops a hand grenade on the enemy. The enemy therefore creates a jamming mechanism for it. Therefore, the Ukrainians now develop a new way of targeting, whether it be through optical tracking or whether it be through terrain mapping that doesn't rely on the GPS signals. And it's just this war, counter war. You've seen those cages over the top of the Russian tanks and armored personnel carriers. They look really weird, but they are specifically designed because of the major threat of drone warfare. And of course, finally, President Zelensky famously said that he wanted to get his defense industrial base to deliver 1 million of these drones every year. And that's a massive number. And it probably goes all the way from the small ones to the big ones, probably with help from the international community. But it probably explains as well why they've taken such a big role in this war, and also why Russia has felt compelled to attack the energy infrastructure and Ukraine's defense industrial base, because it recognizes just the power and the influence that these drones are having on the battlefield.
It's a really good point you raise in terms of how Russia's been using it to obviously strike, as you say, Ukrainian energy infrastructure and towns and cities as well. But of course, Ukraine has been doing the same, and they've also been using drones to go after Russian energy infrastructure. How would you kind of compare the damage that either side have inflicted on each other using drones?
I think, it's a really good question, actually, because I think Russia has had the full spectrum of weapons available to it, long range, short range, ballistic missiles, the like. And it knows where all of Ukraine's energy infrastructure is. I mean, let's face it, it was part of the former Soviet Union. Most of this stuff is not new, and therefore they know exactly where it is. And therefore Russia has been able to strike across the whole country. Russia is a massive country. Ukraine won't necessarily know where all the energy infrastructure is. And besides, it will be incredibly difficult for Ukraine to take out all of Russia's energy infrastructure. Besides, given the limited number of ordnance that Ukraine has, would I, as a military guy, suggest they went after that? Almost certainly not. There are much more juicy targets that Ukraine would want to take out. I think what we have seen over the last year particularly is that Ukraine has wanted to make sure that normal Russians recognize they're in a war. And therefore, it's been less about having decisive impacts on infrastructure and more about making sure that Russians recognize that they are not immune to the effects of this war. And I think the other angle, which Ukraine has tried very effectively to do, is recognize that Russia is funding this war largely through the sale of its oil and gas. And therefore, if you can target the facilities that produce, refine or export those raw materials, then actually you can have a material impact on Russia's ability to finance the war, and that's where they've been very successful.
And Sean, on the topic of sort of Ukrainian strikes against Russia, away from striking energy depots, we've also seen them go after Russian airfields as well, and they have had some success there.
Yeah, they have, James. I mean, it is interesting that Ukraine have tried to get the Russians on the back foot by not being predictable about what they're going to strike. And as you know, airfields generally are fairly well protected. You generally put aircraft in hardened aircraft shelters, and the sort of weapons that Ukraine has aren't going to be effective. But Russia was a bit complacent. They had left some of their aircraft out in the open, and by all accounts, that Ukraine was quite successful at striking them. But you have to look at this in context. We're talking about ones and twos. We're not talking about double figures. And Russia has huge amounts of aircraft. I think the bigger impact was that when the West had decided to give long-range weapons, we fairly swiftly saw Russia move most of its jets beyond the range of those missiles to keep them in safety. Does that impact the war? Not really. It does mean it's more difficult for them to plan missions because the Russians have got to go a lot further there and back. But frankly, if you're short of weapons, I suspect that's an area where Ukraine will probably have higher priority targets.
Spot on. Lovely stuff. Yeah, that's a really good point. We have seen over the course of 2024 the ruble becoming increasingly weak, and particularly, of course, in the summer in the wake of the Kursk incursion, but also towards the end of the year as well. Let's come on to the long-range missiles, Sean, because this was one of the biggest stories of the war in 2024, whether Ukraine should be allowed to use Western-supplied long-range missiles, such as the US-supplied ATACMS, the British Storm Shadows, the French Scout missiles, inside Russian territory. And it wasn't until November that President Biden changed his tack and essentially approved their use, although even then with limits only inside Kursk Oblast. Had that decision come much earlier, as Ukraine wanted, had it come far earlier in 2024, what impact could that have had on the war?
Yeah, this is a question that gets asked pretty regularly. I'm not sure that it would have had a significant impact on the war. It is worth pointing out that the slight irony of all of this, that when the West has provided bullets or anti-tank weapons or rockets or artillery shells, we haven't said they couldn't be used to fire across the border. And yet, for some reason, we decided that a weapon that could travel 100 miles was, well, that's too far, but 20 miles from an artillery shell is okay. And lots of this was frankly due to President Putin saber rattling, particularly around the nuclear threat, and intimidating the West, largely because Putin knew full well that if the West was to get involved in this conflict, that Russia's ambitions would be thwarted in a heartbeat. So it became a bit of an issue which it never really should have been. The UK, my understanding is, when they first gave Storm Shadow to President Zelensky, was as long as you use them in accordance with the law of armed conflict, you use them however you need to. It was only subsequently that America got a bit more concerned about as effectively, Russia had been invaded by Ukraine to the Kursk region, and all of a sudden that might risk an escalation, and said we ought to be more coherent. So it said to the UK, I think you need to rescind that until we're happy as an organisation to provide weapons that are long range. And it became a real issue. But the fact remains is that, first of all, Storm Shadow, they're not available in very large quantities. The Ukrainians have had them for over a year now. We only had, I think, about 500 or 600 available from stocks to give them. I'd be very surprised if there's many left now. ATACMS is a newer form of missile, but that's over $1 million a shot. There's not that many. They can't produce a lot of them. So I honestly don't think it was going to make a great deal of difference. But politically, it made a huge difference and made a real opportunity for President Putin to demonstrate that he has a lot of influence over the West, rather than actually the West just standing firm. Bullies generally respect strength. They don't. They exploit weakness. And we've seen evidence that Putin has exploited that weakness. So I think it's not about the military impact of those weapons. It's actually far more about the political impact.